At 0630 local time, a formation of Ukrainian Beaver drones was moving across the central Black Sea, heading toward Russia's 2PS oil terminal, including the deep water piers and the tankers docked beside them. Up to that point, the operation had unfolded normally, but events were about to shift dramatically. What the Ukrainian drone operators did not realize was that 2 Russian Su-30 fighter jets were already airborne on a combat air patrol. These aircraft were flying a routine CAP pattern, essentially a preset racetrack-shaped route in the sky where fighters circle while waiting for potential threats. Suddenly, their radar detected something unexpected. The lead pilot immediately banked his aircraft sharply. The contacts were 120 miles away, giving the pilots roughly 12 minutes before the drones dropped into the radar-hiding surface clutter close to the water. Both Su-30s descended toward 20,000 feet, pushing their throttles forward, though deliberately avoiding afterburners. They needed to conserve as much fuel as possible for the engagement that might follow. When the distance closed to 90 miles, the lead pilot activated his radar, switching it from standby to active mode. The change was comparable to swapping a simple flashlight for a powerful searchlight. Instantly, strong radar pulses were sweeping the airspace ahead, searching for objects that could reflect those signals. Yet the display remained empty. To improve coverage, the pilot expanded the radar's scan from 70 degrees to 120 degrees, sacrificing refresh speed in exchange for a wider field of view, similar to switching from a standard photo to a panoramic shot. The trade-off allowed him to see more area, but with less detail. The issue came down to physics. The bar's radar installed in the nose of the aircraft detected targets by measuring Doppler shift, meaning it tracked how an object's movement altered the frequency of the radar waves reflected back. This is the same effect that causes an ambulance siren to change pitch as it speeds past you. High-speed fighter jets produce massive Doppler shifts that stand out clearly on radar displays. But these drones were moving at only about 150 knots, generating Doppler signatures barely stronger than the motion of ocean waves. Ironically, the radar's filters, designed to remove clutter from the sea surface, were also filtering out the drones themselves. The tactical setup only made matters worse. Russia had stationed its fighters inside what is called a cat box. Picture a three-dimensional cube of protected airspace where fighters orbit, so they can intercept incoming threats approaching the coastline. However, this defensive box had been designed with a completely different type of conflict in mind. It assumed fast, high-altitude bombers like those used by the United States, not slow drones creeping just above the waves. From 30,000 feet, the Su-30's radar could theoretically detect targets 200 miles away. That sounded impressive, until you considered that drones flying at wave-top level might be practically invisible beyond 40 miles. At 0634, something finally appeared on the lead pilot's infrared search and track system. This time it wasn't radar detection, but heat. Against the cool surface of the early morning sea, the sensors picked up more than a dozen tiny warm specks, like spotting glowing cigarette tips in darkness. The contacts were 38 miles away and closing. Up to that moment, the drones had been flying at medium altitude to preserve fuel, but they were seconds away from descending to the surface and vanishing from detection. The lead pilot pushed his control stick forward and began a steep dive. His radar altimeter numbers unwound rapidly. 25,000, 20,000, 15,000 feet. Meanwhile, the drones were starting their own descent toward the ocean surface. The pilot had only seconds to fire before they disappeared. The Su-30 leveled out at 12,000 feet, lining up with the front cluster of drones. On the heads-up display, the gun sight reticle bounced between 3 targets that were executing their programmed descent. The pilot squeezed the trigger, firing a 2-second burst from the aircraft's 30mm cannon. The shells traveled nearly a mile before one finally struck a drone, knocking it out of the sky and sending it tumbling into the sea. But there was no time for another pass. Exactly 150 miles from 2PS, the remaining drones executed their planned maneuver. They plunged from 2,000 feet down to just 200 feet above the waves. From the pilot's perspective, it looked like coins dropping into cloudy water. One moment the radar showed solid returns. The next, the screen was overwhelmed with surface clutter resembling television static. At the same time, the swarm began to spread out. Half the drones banked left while the rest continued straight ahead, forcing the fighters to divide their focus. With fuel for only a single interception attempt, the Su-30s were being forced to make a choice. What made these drones especially difficult to track was their onboard radar altimeters, which measured their height above the water 40 times per second. Each drone maintained a constant altitude of 60 meters. When waves rose beneath them, they climbed. When passing through troughs, they descended. To a fighter's radar, they effectively blended into the moving surface of the sea. The radar interpreted their signals the same way it interpreted wave reflections, tiny, slow returns that the computer automatically filtered out as background noise. The lead pilot attempted one last method. He switched to velocity search mode, instructing the radar to ignore anything except objects moving between 100 and 200 knots. In theory, this should have highlighted the drones against the relatively stationary ocean. Instead, the radar filled with false contacts, wind-driven spray, breaking wave crests, and even a flock of birds flying north along the coast. The drones had essentially hidden themselves within nature's own electronic camouflage. The wingman descended further to 8,000 feet, hoping a lower viewing angle might help. But that created another serious problem: fuel consumption. Jet engines are designed to operate efficiently in the thin air at high altitude, not the dense atmosphere closer to the surface. Down at 8,000 feet, the aircraft burned fuel at an alarming rate. Every minute spent that low consumed roughly the same amount of fuel as 5 minutes at cruising altitude. The fighters had already been airborne since 0430, and the calculations were becoming brutally clear. Either continue the low-altitude chase and risk running out of fuel, or climb back up and abandon the pursuit. At 0637, ground control made the decision for them. The pilots pulled their aircraft upward, afterburners roaring as they climbed back toward their CAP station. After 5 minutes of engagement, they had destroyed only one drone. The remaining 23 drones continued toward 2PS, now effectively invisible to radar, as they followed their pre-programmed routes along the Russian coastline. But Russia still had another layer of defense. About 53 miles inland, the command post of an S-300 air defense battery was monitoring the handoff from the fighter patrol. The system's main sensor, the 64N6E Big Bird surveillance radar, turned toward the threat direction and switched from its normal rotating scan to a focused sector search. It was similar to a lighthouse that normally spins in circles, suddenly concentrating all of its light into a single direction. The Big Bird radar, roughly the size of a small building, transmitted an enormous 350 kilowatts of power, enough electricity to supply around 350 homes, all directed toward finding the drones. On paper, this radar could detect a fighter jet 300 kilometers away. But these incoming targets were not fighters. Each Beaver drone had a radar cross-section roughly comparable to a large seagull, about half a square meter. With such a small signature, the radar's maximum detection range dropped to perhaps 80 kilometers, and that only under ideal circumstances. Unfortunately for the operators, conditions were far from ideal. By 0640, the radar operator was watching his display with growing irritation. The number of detected contacts fluctuated wildly with every sweep: 12 drones, then 7, then 15, then 4. The automated tracking system, built to follow supersonic aircraft and cruise missiles, struggled to maintain locks on these tiny, slow targets that repeatedly slipped below the radar horizon. Tracking them was like trying to follow leaves drifting across a pond. They appeared, vanished, merged together, and separated again unpredictably. The physics behind this problem came from the curvature of the Earth. Although radar beams travel in straight lines, the planet's curved surface limits how far they can see. With the Big Bird antenna mounted about 25 meters high, the radar horizon for an object flying 60 meters above the water was only about 22 kilometers. This meant the drones would be clearly visible to the engagement radar for only about 3 minutes, before they dipped below the horizon again. 3 minutes to detect, track, identify, target, and destroy more than 20 drones. The battery commander faced a harsh decision. Each 48N6E2 missile cost around $2 million, while each drone cost perhaps $50,000. If he fired at every uncertain contact, he could rapidly deplete his missile supply chasing phantom signals. Yet if he waited for perfect tracking information, the drones would reach Chwopsy before any engagement could occur. This was the mathematics of modern warfare. Sometimes the cheaper weapon gains the advantage simply by existing in large numbers. At 0642, with the leading drones approximately 65 kilometers away, the commander authorized the attack. It was now or never. The vertical launch tubes erupted in rapid succession. 4 missiles launched within 3 seconds. Each rocket surged upward on a column of flame that illuminated the early morning sky. Rather than flying directly toward the drones, the missiles climbed steeply first, trading speed for altitude in a maneuver known as a lofted trajectory.